Hello and welcome to Join Our Town. I'm your host, Tammy Jo Johnson. Join Our Town brings you the issues and problems that are faced in the local community with the hope of finding a solution. Our guest for this segment is Melissa Lindsay, staff attorney for the Family and Youth Law Center of Capital University Law School. She has joined us today to share important information regarding juvenile records expungement, along with the challenges associated with youth offenders having a criminal record. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Melissa.
Thank you for having me.
So before we jump into this topic, tell us a little bit about yourself as a staff attorney. What is that like?
Well, I've been an attorney for 6 years now. When I started out, I did an Equal Justice Works Fellowship on prisoner reentry issues, so adult issues, okay. Helping folks reacclimate after a period of incarceration. After that, I was a public defender for almost 3 years, so I kind of handled the front end of things. Right. And I've joined the Family and Youth Law Center just over a year ago to work primarily in our Youth Justice Project, as well as our Family and Youth Advocacy Center, which is our direct service program where we help current and former foster youth, as well as youth who have been involved in the juvenile justice system with all kinds of civil legal needs.
And so that's your primary responsibility now, is just to help in that aspect?
Correct, yes.
Nice. So we're here to talk about juvenile records and expungement. Before we talk about what expungement is, define for our viewers, what is a juvenile offender?
So I think it's important to just kind of understand the juvenile court a little bit and the juvenile court system in Ohio. To simplify a very complex system, there's kind of two sides, basically. The one side being the child welfare system, which handles the abuse and neglect and dependency cases when the state steps in if parents aren't providing for their kids the way they need to. Right. The other side being the delinquency and unruly side. So that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about juvenile court records. These are charges that are brought against people who are under 18 that would be misdemeanors or felonies if charged against an adult, someone over 18. Those would be delinquency cases is what we call those. Unruly cases are more status offenses, truancy, that type of thing. So offenses that only someone who is under 18 can commit, essentially. So really, when we're talking about juvenile court records, particularly in the sealing and expungement context, it's those delinquency records. Those are the ones that that are applicable under that type of process, and those are the ones that really cause problems for people as they move past their youthful mistakes and try to move on and become productive adults.
And I guess that's one of the main questions we can start with. I thought that a juvenile record was an adjudication and therefore doesn't carry over as an adult. Is that not true?
Well, it's true and it's not. That's a common problem, and honestly, I think as we've seen, the last 20, 25 years of technology evolve, the statutes and sort of people's way of thinking about the court system hasn't necessarily caught up to technology. And yes, juvenile adjudications are supposed to be confidential. These are not supposed to follow people throughout their lives. It's supposed to be something that stays in the juvenile court. Unfortunately, that's not what's happening anymore. We know background check companies, both the state entities as well as private companies, are reporting juvenile adjudications. So that means when somebody has a background check run on them and they didn't tell a potential employer or housing provider or whoever it might be that's running the background check that they had a juvenile adjudication because they didn't think they needed to, that record comes up and oftentimes can be a big problem for them. So yes, it's supposed to be confidential, but we're seeing more and more that it's not, and that's why it's so important for people to take the steps to get these records sealed and expunged. Wow.
And by law, they are allowed to say no, because most applications either go back years or they say as an adult. In those cases, is the employer, breaking the law?
That again it's sort of a dicey issue, like kind of all legal issues can be, particularly in a state like Ohio, where we have some pretty generous employer protections. So I always advise people to, answer the question that's asked, most certainly. And then if there's, if something is returned on a background check that's outside the question that's asked, I think that person has, a good argument, certainly. Now, whether or not they keep that job, that is, that's
right,
a different matter.
Because once they see it, it's seen.
Exactly. Right. And so that's the problem.
And the background check companies are a little different than court records. Employers, they don't always go through the court to check your records. They hire background companies that do that.
Right. So there's a couple of different ways that it can be done. In Ohio, all the court dockets are online, so an employer could just use the free online service. Those are not supposed to be used as background checks because the court says, this is just sort of our way of giving the public information. We're not guaranteeing this is correct. This has pending information on it, all that sort of thing. So there's that. Employers are not supposed to be using that. And then there's the background check companies. These a lot of times are private companies. They have the industry has just absolutely boomed in the last 10 years. There are thousands and thousands of these companies now all around the country who check information in different ways and then provide that information to employers. Sometimes they will sort of just go out to a courthouse on any particular date and time, pull records, and then not update those records. So if, depending on what was happening at that particular point in time, that is the information that's going to be reported, which can be problematic for a lot of different reasons.
It's very unfortunate because I know when you're talking about the court docket, you're talking about FCMC clerk. Yeah, when people, because and again, people can do their own background checks as well, but when you're talking about FCMC clerk, you're talking about cases that are open, that are pending, and things like that, right?
Exactly, yep.
Wow.
And no one knows what the outcome's going to be, and obviously, a lot of cases get dismissed or otherwise, go away without somebody being found responsible, but that information, could still be used against the person. So there's lots of problems, and I think, again, the laws just haven't quite caught up yet to this unbelievable amount of information that's readily available.
Wow, and just moving us right along in sequence here, an arrest record is almost the same, except the person has been arrested but not necessarily charged, right?
Right. So when we're in the juvenile court context for arrest records, that information is not going to be very easily accessible, just, sort of in the public realm, because that's police information, and then once it's filed with the court, the juvenile courts do not have online dockets. So that's a good thing, as far as my opinion goes. And so that information is not going to be very easy for someone to find, but still, those arrest records obviously then lead to potential delinquency charges. And in the juvenile court context, arrest records that are not pursued, essentially, so cases that do not go through the formal process, those are automatically sealed. So that's one good thing for juveniles. But in the adult court context, absolutely, from the moment that ticket is filed, that information's public.
Wow. And so, yeah, thank you for that information, because I know that it can get really confusing when you're talking about court and arrest and things like that and public records. Tell us the difference between the sealing of a juvenile record and then the expungement of a juvenile record.
Sure. So it's basically a two-step process. Sealing is the first step. And what sealing says under the law is that, and again, this is another example of our laws not quite catching up, says that the record physically needs to be removed from wherever the court typically holds their records and put in a secure location. Now, of course, we don't have physical records really anymore. They're all electronic. And then expungement says that that record is to be permanently and completely destroyed. So sealing allows a person to say, I've never had a juvenile court record. The statute's very clear there. But it still allows some government agencies to see it. And then when we go through that final process of expungement, that's when it's totally destroyed and no one should ever be able to see it again.
So what's that process like for someone as an adult that want to do that because maybe they're having a hard time getting a job or a particular job?
Sure. So with and again, we're talking about anything that happened in that juvenile delinquency court, those juvenile adjudications. There's no age limit or anything like that. At any point in time, someone can apply to have it sealed. You're going to want to go to the court where that originally heard your case. And in Ohio, I always recommend that we call the clerk of court's office first, because every county in Ohio does things just a little differently. Some make it easier and some make it harder on folks. Here locally in Franklin County, the process is very streamlined and usually can be taken care of in about 15 minutes down at the courthouse, which is nice. Others require like a full formal motion to be filed. Basically what you're saying is, I have been rehabilitated. I've taken these different steps in my life and I'm asking the court to acknowledge that and remove this from my record. But ultimately it's up to the judge to decide.
Wow. We know that there are some challenges with that. Of course, it's going to depend on what the crime was and things like that. What are some of the convictions of a juvenile record that can't be sealed or expunged?
In the juvenile world, there's actually only 3, which is great. Aggravated murder, murder, and rape. Those are the 3 convictions that could never be sealed. Otherwise, every other juvenile adjudication is at least eligible to be sealed.
When you say that, is that a law that has always been in effect, or is that fairly new?
In terms of the number or the type of convictions?
That can be sealed.
Yeah, as far as I understand it, I believe that's a late 70s law. So yes, that has been around for a while. And then when we get on the adult side, that's much, much different. There's a number of convictions that can never be sealed, but in the juvenile side, it's just those 3.
Okay, and I know that with some juvenile records, especially with those 3 crimes associated with a record, there is still a process that they can go through called a pardon through the governor. Is that the case?
Yes, yes, there are pardons available through the governor's office, and then there's also an appeal to the U.S. president that is also an option for folks.
So there should be no reason why a juvenile record should stop anyone from being able to pursue what it is they want to do if these are in place and the rehabilitation has taken place and like you said, things like that, right?
Right, and again, I just always have to make sure people understand it is the judge's decision ultimately.
It is, right.
You can apply as many times as you want. There's no limit on the number of times someone can apply to have something sealed, and sometimes, judges will say, hey, you know what, it's only been 2 or 3 years since this happened. Let's have you get another year or 2 under your belt of good work experience or something like that. So you may run into those kinds of things, but ultimately I think the legislature in the writing of the statutes made it clear that with juvenile adjudications, we really want to be giving people a second chance, and I think most judges view it that way too.
And that makes a lot of sense now. I know that there's a lot of question about how do I get this done? I didn't even know that that was possible. Juvenile people that committed crimes as juveniles, they didn't know this. How is the community being educated? Like, how would someone even know that this is possible?
Some of the juvenile judges have started telling people at the sentencing, but this is relatively new. So folks who have older adjudications may not have been made aware of that at the time. We provide self-help resources on our website. We provide a number of self-help resources there, including an animated video with voiceover. So for folks that maybe have some challenges with reading and writing, the information's presented in a couple different ways. We also, through our direct service program, represent youth and adults, younger adults, on these kinds of matters as well for free.
Wow, thank you so much. That was a lot of information that you gave us, and I hope that it helps. Thank you so much for being here with us today. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Coming up next on Join Our Town, Youth Justice. Don't go away. We'll be right back.